back in June, the Aspen Institute released a report suggesting that 577 or close to 578,000 renters in Arizona might face evictions by the end of the third quarter of this year. I want to ask Courtney, and by the way, this report assumes that 30% of Arizona renters are going to be unemployed. Courtney, what is the situation today with the rental community?
So first of all, maybe I could address that study because we've had to address this several times. Unfortunately, studies sometimes they're not based on the best methodology. So I would venture to say the Aspen Institute study is pretty significantly flawed. So like you just mentioned, they're suggesting a 30% unemployment rate in Arizona. Obviously, our unemployment rate right now is close to 8.9%. We've never ventured anywhere near 30%. The other kind of startling number is statewide, we have 920,000 rental units in the state. So this study would project that at least 65% of rental residents in Arizona would be evicted. But we know, according to the National Multi-Housing Study, that about 95% of residents are paying their rent. So there's no way, this is just statistically impossible for this to occur. But what we are seeing with renters in Arizona is, it is honestly better than we had anticipated. Like I just mentioned, at least 95% or somewhere in that range are paying their rent. That number is a little bit off because it doesn't include student housing and affordable housing. So we actually expect that number is a little bit less. But all in all, we're extremely pleased with those percentages in Arizona. And we don't believe that there is an eviction cliff coming or a massive eviction crisis in our future, as the Aspen Institute and some others would have predicted.
There, what about the number of renters who, let me back up a bit. So, it's good to know that renters are, or the majority, a big majority, overwhelming majority, and in fact, keeping up with rent payments. How many renters have sort of gone dark? The renters that you couldn't get to for one reason or another, and
that is actually a really important number. So our industry, and John can go into this too, sure. What we've really done is we've calculated, or we've kind of triaged the industry. Just earlier this month, we did a survey that included 117,000 rental units throughout the state. So it's about 12% of the industry. And what we found is 2.8% or almost 3% of residents are on some sort of payment plan. They're fine, they're protected. They're really our level 3, if you will. And then about 0.65% were at least communicating with their property owner and letting them know they're looking for resources, their family's going to help, they may have faith-based resources, they might have applied for state resources. So those residents are going to be fine. We're going to help them find the resources that they need to stay in their housing. Our biggest concern, and what we kind of refer to as our level 1, are residents that have gone completely dark. They are ghosting us, and it's about 0.77% or less than 1% that we're really concerned about, because we don't know, for whatever reason, they're having a difficult time paying their rent, or they're having a difficult time accessing those resources, but they're simply not communicating. And that is the problem. We have to have that open communication.
And we'll get back to that at some point, but let me go to John. John, what are the kinds of problems and challenges that you're facing, your own residential units? What are the tenants telling you in terms of, where they're struggling and why they're struggling?
Sure. I think, let me just touch first on what we call phantom occupancy. So what Courtney mentioned was exactly right. We have, as a portfolio of just under 18,000 units, Class A units, we have 0.9% of our renters are ghosting us. We'll say it that way. So despite us reaching out to them, trying to communicate, trying to work with them, they're not responding and not paying. So if you think about the beginning of the eviction moratorium and now the extension through October 31st, it really puts us in a precarious position as landlord, because we're not able to deal with those specific residents as bad players. The good players, meaning people that are trying to work with us and we want to keep them in their units, we want to work with them in a partial payment system, are willing to communicate, and that's been positive. But what we're finding is, in terms of folks that are in that partial payment scenario, it's really layoffs, it's furloughs, potentially in the service industry. Our sector based in terms of our employment sectors are high in service. So if you think about the service industry being started and stopped, it's very difficult for those folks. So they've been highly reliant, in my opinion, on the unemployment insurance programs. So we know that's set to sunset this week. We think there will be an extension of some sort if you follow the news. But nonetheless, it's a dire situation for many residents because of that unemployment insurance expiring this week potentially.
Representative Toma, I want to ask you your response, your reaction to the extension of the moratorium on evictions. It was supposed to expire this week, and now it's been extended to October. What are your thoughts, sir?
Well, thanks for the softball question, Luigi. It's
The hard ball's coming.
Right. Good to know. Yeah, it's an interesting debate. On the one hand, I think many of us understand that there's just a sense of uncertainty overall in terms of just what's going on. I mean, you mentioned that study that Courtney, you had asked Courtney a question on, and so much of the initial projections were very, very doom and gloom, both in terms of what's going to happen to the unemployment, to the housing market, to state budgets, to all the, I don't know if you remember, but back around that same time, we were supposed to be in up to a $1.6 billion shortfall overall for the state budget. So that has turned out, luckily, to not be, fortunately, to not be true. And it looks like we're doing much better than some of those early doom and boom projections. I think the housing market and the rental market are doing the same thing. And I think what you're seeing is that landlords, by and large, are reasonable people. They're people, they understand, and they try to work with tenants, partially because I think they want to do the right thing, but also partially because in my short experience as a landlord, and I'm not a landlord now, but I have been in the past, it's better and easier and just better policy to try to work with the tenants you have than it is to try to get them out and get new tenants in. So I think that's what's actually happening. Now, in terms of specifically the moratorium, I don't envy the governor for any of the many hard decisions that he has to make, given the information that's out there now. So I'll start with that. The devil's in the details on a lot of these things. And I think, unfortunately, this is one that I'm not a fan of in terms of the extension itself, partially because I'm always going to be loath and very hesitant to approve of any sort of government interference in private business and in private contracts of any kind. And the reason for that is that I think it's a slippery slope, and although it may be very well intention now and maybe even warranted in some cases, I do think that it could easily lead to abuse in the future once you set that precedent. So, I'm hoping, and I'm going to continue to try to work with my colleagues and with governor's office and everybody else on this call, at least to the extent possible, to try to get some more clarity and some more details and kind of structure around this in order to make sure that those 1% perhaps, or whatever was quoted as being kind of bad actors that are potentially taking advantage of some of these extensions are actually brought into line, if you will, and to ensure that those that truly do need the help, that have been furloughed, that have been laid off, that do need just additional time to try to get back on a payment plan or whatever it is that they've agreed to, that they do have the resources necessary. So, for example, part of it that I did like was the fact that additional money was allocated to the various agencies and nonprofits that do some of these programs in order to ensure that the backlog is gone through much faster. So those are, I think, good steps and steps in the right direction. I just think there's more clarity that we need to work through.
Thank you, Danny. I want to ask you. Oh, before Danny, Matt, how's your industry doing? How are the realtors doing? How are buying and selling of homes at this point?
Our industry is actually doing fantastic. The realtors took a real proactive step of kind of self-governing as an industry, making sure that we put in the best safety protocols to protect our buyers, our renters, our sellers. We represent realtors, we represent brokers, we represent property managers. My members are busy, and we're really seeing this as a time to step up and make sure that we help. One of the real thriving aspects of Arizona's economy, we've seen that similarly that 1% go dark. Talking to some of my property management companies, they see landlords working with tenants in unprecedented manners. To Mr. Thomas' comment, evictions are bad for business. These are our customers. These are the people that my members and the property owners serve. So really trying to work with individuals, whether they're struggling with getting assistance from a PUA unemployment assistance program, getting rental assistance, really just seeing and advocating for a deployment of assistance dollars on all fronts. So hoping to keep the real estate market strong, not seeing any real fears or storms coming in the distance, but we're optimistic right now.
Danny, you have this moratorium on evictions that's been going on for a couple of months now. You have unemployment insurance benefits that for most people, if they've gotten them earlier, those are expiring, very soon.
Sure.
The governor has, ceased the operations of some businesses, right? Gyms, bars. If you're a restaurant, you can only open up to 50% capacity. So some sectors of our economy are, effectively shuttered. What are you seeing in terms of where we're at, in our economy? And I guess more importantly, in terms of, what this means really moving forward.
In terms of jobs specifically, or?
In terms of jobs, in terms of the state's ability to collect revenue, in terms of, local government's ability to collect revenue as well. But I guess, also, what kind of a rebound are we going to see, and how quickly are we going to see a rebound?
Yeah. Well, so fortunately, we do have a couple months of a state reopening and what our state looked like when the state was able to reopen. So we actually saw some really good numbers in May and June of job gains. Just in June, the private sector gained 67,000 jobs. Now, what the state reported is a net increase of 20,000 jobs, because that's when in June is when teachers usually drop off the payrolls. So historically, we usually see a decline in jobs in June. We actually saw an increase. So you saw in May and June, and by the way, Arizona is actually the best performing state in terms of employment, or the second best state in terms of employment so far this year. And Greater Phoenix is the best employment market in terms of a metro area so far this year. So I think we're positioned really well to recover when we can do that full recovery. And also we saw these 2 months of when a state can reopen and how well we're able to do. So we're still down on jobs. Basically the entire nation is. So all we really have is to look at it from a relative standpoint. So relatively, Arizona is in a great position. And once we can get COVID-19 under control and can reopen, I think the state's economy is going to be in really good shape.
Given, what you're describing seems to be a really good, or at least a better situation for the economy. Can you weigh in on whether renters, have the ability to pay at this point? And what does the eviction moratorium mean for the state economy?
Yeah, and so we started looking at this back in April when it first started, and I think we were in the same position as everybody else. Is you just had no idea what could possibly happen, and you're seeing news reports. So you would see a headline saying, a third of renters are going to not pay rent, or even a rent strike or something like that. So you're left with a whole host of scenarios of what could possibly happen. And, if that were to happen, a huge percentage of renters not paying, you're looking at, losses in the billions of dollars in the state's economy. So fortunately, that has not happened. We've seen far less people in this non-payment, and even those in non-payment on some sort of payment plan or communicating. But still, even 1%, now that we're extending the moratorium for 7 months, and then these, John or Courtney could probably say better than us, but when an eviction happens, it's not just an immediate, okay, you're out the door. It could be 1 or 2 more months where that unit can't be rented. So even a 1%, 1% non-payment, you're talking about a $90 million loss in rent payments in the state. And apartment owners are in this unique position that it's been decided that you're an essential service. So you have to keep operating and also not necessarily get paid for that service. So there's 2 things there. So that's the situation we were looking at in April is, okay, you have to keep operating and you could lose all this income. How long can you bear the brunt of that financial burden?
Well, John, let me ask you, how long can you take the brunt of that kind of a financial burden?
It really depends on specific ownership groups, but think about, and Matt could speak to this, think about someone who is retired and owns 2 homes that they're renting out, and one of those 2 renters chooses not to pay for 7 months. That's substantial and probably forcing them to reach into savings that potentially they don't have. It's a dire situation on many fronts for landlords. And really, at this point, when we're collecting rents, many think it goes right to the landlord, but you have to think about us as an essential service. We're covering mortgages, insurance, utilities, expenses that continue forward. Those don't stop. Property taxes are paid. They're not relinquished. So there's a lot of things that are required by the landlord, and to carry that through October with no possible eviction for the bad players is a difficult pill to swallow for sure.
And if I could add a little bit of perspective to that, over half of rental units are in those smaller property types. These aren't all apartment communities owned by large corporations. Over half the rental market is single family homes, duplexes, fourplexes, and those are typically owned by those individuals.
Courtney or John, what's been, you mentioned that some folks have kind of gone dark, right? So you can't really you can't reach them, they haven't really communicated, but what's the, do you have any theories as to why they've just not communicated with you?
Sure.
Go ahead, John.
Most of our partial pay renters that are on payment plans are very willing to work with us. They're conversing with our managers at the community or our managing directors, and there's a working relationship with both sides. I think with these ghost renters, they're really gaming the system. Regardless of their situation, there's funds accessible, which Courtney can refer to, but not willing to communicate, not willing to pay. We have balances upwards of $10,000 today per unit, and the further it gets kicked down the road, the more they probably hunker down and squat and just say, you know what, I'm just going to see how this plays out. I'm not going to pay the landlord. I'm going to make sure I keep my housing, and that's a difficult situation for both sides.
So, as I mentioned earlier, we have a situation in which some sectors of our economy are shuttered, right? Unemployment insurance benefits are expiring pretty soon for many Arizonans. So we do have this problem in which some people, may not have income. They do need housing. We are, the message from our state is that stay at home if you can. Well, they do need a house to stay in. And so I want to talk about, in fact, what's available in terms of assistance to renters. And, the governor, for example, has put in $5 million for rental assistance. And last time Director Carol Dittmore was here with us in a morning scoop, she said that, only about $1 million of that funding had been dispersed, right? So where are we at in terms of, and I don't know, John or Courtney, but where are we in terms of, dispersing the rental assistance to folks?
And I can talk a little bit about that. But first, I kind of want to continue with what Matt was saying earlier. I mean, the rental housing industry has done everything they can when COVID hit and during when the initial eviction delay was put into place. We're an incredibly compassionate industry. So we've worked with residents, we've waived fees, we've reduced rent, we've implemented payment plans. When this was put into place, we didn't resort to social media or complain about the executive order. We worked with the hand that we were dealt. As an industry, we focused on what is best for our renters, what is best for our members. And that was working with state government, working with local communities, and advocating for rental resources. So to date, we actually have about 130 million statewide. So that includes the state and local jurisdictions that's either already available or can quickly be dedicated for rent and utility assistance. To date, so Carol mentioned last month that about 100 million has been deployed at the state level. Unfortunately, today, only 1.2 million. I mean, I looked at the report this morning from the Department of Housing from July 17th. And a little over almost 1.2 million has been deployed. Now, the applications that have been submitted account for 9.3 million. So these are applications that have been in the system potentially from April 1. So we have got to get this money deployed. The red tape, the unnecessary regulations and qualifications are slowing down the assistance. And that makes both the renter and the rental homeowner really the victim. Last week, cities and counties started deploying their money. We're hopeful, we're gonna keep our fingers crossed that those monies get out faster and deployed quicker to the residents. But so we're hoping to see a much more efficient system.
So let me pause here for a second. If you're, to our viewers and to our listeners, I do want to encourage you to ask questions, which you can send in via the chat room or via the Q&A room. We'll allocate some time to try and answer as many questions as we can. But Representative Toma, when you hear, that the fact that there's $130 million in potential rental assistance to folks, and only a fraction of that has been distributed, the legislature is not in session, so there's really not much you can do about this situation. But what do you think the legislature can do? Not just if you were in a special session, but maybe next year when you're actually in regular session.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think most of us are willing to go back and go to work if needed, whether in a special or right at the beginning of the next session. I think there will be quite a few things actually that we're going to need to take care of, assuming that there is no special session once January comes around. And at that point, we should have a better idea of the lay of the land, if you will. And hopefully by then we'll have COVID well under control, if not necessarily eradicated. So that said, I did want to just briefly point out that I think some of those funds, 130 million or so that was referenced, I think have already been earmarked to various counties and whatnot. So, but we still have at least 80 million left, to my knowledge, that should be available.
Is that on top of the 130 million?
No, that's out of the 130.
Out of the 130 million.
50 million has been allocated to various programs already, and I think counties and whatnot. But still, we have 80 million, and we've only dispersed about 1.2 million, as Courtney mentioned. So I think there's plenty of opportunity to do that. And and I've always been a fan of cutting down red tape, regardless of the context. Not necessarily here, even before COVID, right? So to the extent that that's possible, and to the extent that we can help in the legislature, you have my word that that's something that I'm going to continue to pursue. I think streamlining is a good idea. Obviously, the challenge with streamlining is you don't want to be in a position where you eliminate certain safeguards and then allow bad actors to take advantage, right? That's why you have, at least in theory, that's why you have the so-called red tape to begin with, or that's why it builds up, if you will. But there's various safety protocols and whatnot that are put in place to ensure that people don't abuse it, or people that don't really need it get it, right? And that's what we want to try to avoid. Because let's face it here, none of that money is free, right? We're going to pay for it eventually, one way or the other. It's public funds that we should be good stewards of. So for those reasons, I think we do want to tread carefully. At the same time, if there's anything specific that maybe is a regulation that perhaps is outdated, or anything we can do to streamline the process, eliminate perhaps any regulatory burden that is legislative in nature, or that was legislated, I think that's something that we definitely should have at the top of our agenda come January, if not before.
What about the idea, Representative Toma, of doing what's necessary to quickly disperse the money and sort of catching if there are any bad actors, like at the back end, right? So the idea would then to cut down on the red tape, get the money to as many people as you can, and if there are sort of bad actors, people who might take advantage of the situation, you kind of catch them at some point later on. But right now, it's they just quickly dispersing the amounts would kind of inject this much money into the economy, but also immediately help renters. What about that idea?
Well, part of the reason before we went into sine die, we set aside $50 million for the governor's office to be able to do some of those sort of triage type things that you're talking about, financial triage, if you will. We really need help in this area, whatever that area happens to be. Housing, I think, is clearly one of them now, or given the context of our discussion now. But the point is, I think you see a willingness from the legislature to understand that might be necessary, and that certain things have to be done quickly. And if you don't act quickly, then you've sort of missed your opportunity, or you compound the pain, if you will. So I think, to answer your question, if there is anything specific that does need to be done quickly, then by all means, let's have that discussion with everybody involved, stakeholders here, governor's office, the legislature, House, Senate, and so on, and make sure that we actually get those removed. But if you're asking if I would be comfortable with the idea of a certain amount of, or taking the risk, if you will, that a certain amount of waste perhaps might be, because I think that's kind of where you were going with that.
Right. Right.
I think that's inherent in any process. Whether it's a private business or government, there's always going to be some amount of waste, and there's always going to be the opportunity for improvement. So to answer your question sort of bluntly, yeah, I think that's something we're going to have to be comfortable with to some extent, but obviously then need to make sure that we have those systems and options in place to make sure that if there are bad actors, that we are able to identify at some point, that we go after them. And remember, for every bad actor, that means there's less assistance available, and I don't mean just financial, but just less processing power, if you will, and causes delays and everything else for everybody that really does need help. So it's not just that, oh, well, so-and-so got a little bit of free money that they shouldn't have gotten. It's that by doing so, they've now taken the resources and the availability of those resources, in addition to the time to process and so on, that could have gone to actually help somebody else. So quite honestly, I think I'll leave heat jokes alone, but there should be a hotter place in hell for those people that take advantage of situations like this when there are people that truly need the assistance.
So Matt, I want to ask you, what are you hearing from your members in terms of their tenants' ability to access, rental assistance? We've mentioned a fraction of the amount, and I think it's 1 million out of the 5 million initially that had been allocated to the housing department for rental assistance had been deployed. But as Courtney mentioned, there's more money out there that's available for renters who may be struggling. So from the ground, what are you hearing from your members, Matt?
Well, I'm hearing a lot of just general fatigue, whether that's my members turning into kind of social workers voluntarily and happily. Again, these are people that have supported their business of the rental housing industry, and so it's pointing them towards the right assistance, whether that's in the pandemic unemployment assistance, federal dollars that are coming in, if their tenant's an independent contractor, or rental assistance directly. But right now with rental assistance, I'm hearing from some members that it's kind of, being lost in the desert and having to prove how thirsty you are. They're having to completely, kind of deplete every last resource. And again, to Mr. Toma's point, we're not advocating that we just unsecurely deploy all these dollars. A set of benchmarks has been put in place via executive order. We advocated similar benchmarks meet those same requirements for assistance because, again, these folks are in a very dire place. Some of their private property rights have already been stripped through programs in the CARES Act. They see recent executive orders as additional stripping of their private property rights. And so they're trying to manage the system. Some of these folks have had to sell their primary residence to consider moving into their rental property because of losses they're experiencing. So, they are, they run a wide gamut of, demographics, really just trying to understand and navigate the system. It's really become a fishing expedition, and we're fielding calls almost every day of just trying to point them in the right direction or the clearest direction of where assistance lies.
So let me quickly follow. I'm sorry, Courtney, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to kind of echo what Matt had to say. I mean, the extending of the executive order through Halloween, is completely frightening for our industry. And I can tell you from my perspective, I think this is maybe the single most important moment in our state history for private property rights in the state. And the executive order further infringes on our ability to contract, as it nullifies, even if it's just temporary, some of the provisions in our existing contracts. So the frustration that we're feeling is the executive order doesn't solve the problem. It kicks the can down the road. We have to get to the root of the problem and solve that, and that is getting the resources to the renters. Houston deployed $15 million in 2 hours. As a state, we haven't deployed, we've deployed almost 1.2 in 4 months. And I understand we had to stand up the program. The program went into effect in April. So by all means, April, May should have been bad month, but we're now talking June, July. We've got to get the resources deployed.
So Danny, we always see these sort of systemic issues. Let me back up a bit. So, we've always had housing problems, right? And they're all coming to a head, and they have all been magnified as a result of this crisis. What I'm hearing from Courtney, from John, from Matt, is that we have systems in place to deploy, to disperse, assistance to folks, but we're using kind of, a system that's pre-crisis, right? Now we have this crisis, and I wonder from your end as an economist, like what can you do to sort of quickly deploy the resources without necessarily sort of giving up on all the safety measures that's available?
Yeah, I might have to defer. I won't even pretend to be able to administer government programs or anything like that.
Let me ask you a different question then.
Okay.
Like, what is in my mind at least, it seems common sense to me that if you deploy funding quickly to people, it doesn't just help them immediately in their situation, right? But overall, it injects like a big amount of money into the economy, and that kind of helps everybody.
Absolutely. Okay. So yeah, absolutely. Consumers are 70% of the economy, and that was the whole impetus behind the CARES Act. It was, there's problems with it, and people saying, okay, maybe it was too high. There's individuals that are making more than they were employed. But there was a trade-off between speed and getting it just right. So I think, given what they had and the emergency that it was, and basically having lived through the Great Recession in 2007 and 8, there was an emergency that speed sort of took over from getting it just right. And I think that was probably the right thing. And so I think that applies here too, is if you can deploy that as quickly as possible, that has the greatest benefit to the economy. You're keeping people out of trouble. You're keeping people out of financial trouble. If all of this ended up with where everybody's in bankruptcy court and tied up for years and years, that is a huge drag on the economy. So the speed at which you can fix that problem and deploy those resources is a huge benefit to the economy.
John, let me ask you, what are the, let's say I'm a renter and I'm really struggling, right? My unemployment insurance expiring. My company is shuttered, right? temporarily ceased operations. Like, all right, so what do I do? Where do I turn to for help? What kinds of assistance and where? Because who do I call?
Well, to Courtney's point, we're supplying each of our renters, through our managers of community operations at each site, information and links to get that rental assistance program access. Despite the slowness of those being processed, we're encouraging them to reach out and use those sources. Additionally, we're working with them in terms of transferring. If they want to transfer to a unit, we'll do that. We're trying to be as flexible as possible. The last thing we want to do is move anybody out. It's expensive, it's taxing on the renter. So we're doing everything we can possible to support them in their home. And
I'm sorry, when you say transferring people, what do you mean transferring people?
So let's say someone's in a higher charge 2-bedroom, they might move into a 1-bedroom to downsize. You see that often in terms of just trying to cut costs. So we'll be flexible. We eliminate the transfer fees. We help with them. We might guide them in terms of who to use for moving. So we're just trying to be as supportive as possible.
In terms of having a payment agreement, right? So you're struggling and you want to work with your landlord. What's the, let's say you're paying typically it's $900 to $1,200 a month, right? So when you do go into kind of a payment plan, what does that look like in terms of, your rent?
It just depends. I mean, it's case by case. So let's say it's $1,000 and they're able to pay $200 every 2 weeks. We'll work on that in terms of the extension going past the moratorium. We're doing everything we can. So it's case by case, but we're just trying to work with everyone to ensure that they have a place to call home.
Yeah, and Luigi, as far as resources that are available, the Department of Housing last week posted all of the resources available by county. So it's it's housing.arizona.gov. And then if you click on the eviction prevention, it'll list resources by county. ArizonaMultiHousing.org also has resources under our COVID-19 for renters. And right now the state has the 5 million. Most of the other resources are in the cities and counties, but the state does still have access to the 35 million that the legislature earmarked or appropriated for assistance. So that can also be quickly dedicated and should be dedicated to renter resources.
And I just shared, if you can see it on your screen, I just shared the Department of Housing website that has the counties. And if you click on each county, let's say, for example, Maricopa County, it also lays out for you, what can you do, where can you go, how you can apply.
So Maricopa County has $30 million available. City of Phoenix has 25 million. I know Pima County is getting ready to allocate, I think, 15 million. So resources are coming. Some cities and towns and counties are further along than others. But over the last 4 months, we have been working closely with local governments, urging them to set aside COVID CARES money to renters that are impacted.
Again, to those who are listening in, go to housing.az.gov. That's the Arizona Department of Housing's website. And you can just kind of play around with that website and you should be able to see the resources that are available to you. If you're a renter, you're struggling to pay. And so that's, go there and see what might be available. I think at this point, we're going to go to some of the questions that have been asked. Give me like a minute to pull them up here. By the way, Courtney, just real quick, you mentioned, that only a fraction of the state money has been dispersed so far. What are you hearing in terms of why why is there a bottleneck?
Yeah, so I think Matt hit the nail on the head earlier that there's just general fatigue. So we have residents that applied in April and have not heard anything. But we also, I know the qualifications have been reduced, but there's a lot of paperwork that has to be submitted at the state level. Unlike what we're seeing at the City of Phoenix. At the City of Phoenix, you need to produce your lease, an ID, and whatever your COVID impact is. So we anticipate those funds are going to be released a lot quicker through the state. You have to show what your income is so that you can pay at least 30% of your income towards the rent. Having that additional information, those additional calculations takes up administrative time and makes the process slower. So that's why we are hopeful that the state and local resources will get deployed quicker. But we also have to see the state dedicate more than $5 million. They have up to $35 million they can dedicate to rental resources, and they need to dedicate that before the COVID relief fund runs out.
Here's a question from Pauline. We are affiliated with St. Vincent de Paul. The people that have come in requesting rental assistance in many cases are COVID related. In cases where the situation is related to COVID, the response has been slow. They know they cannot get evicted, but don't want to continue to defer debt. What is the typical response time to the cases requesting assistance? Maybe John, if you're hearing from members about just how much time we're talking about before people can get assistance.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So, that's part of the issue when we reach out and work with different residents, and mostly all these residents are good players. They just want to pay their rent and stay in their home. But to Courtney's point, most often we hear that they've applied and haven't heard back. So that's the difficult situation that we're in.
What about for landlords that, maybe have one or two housing units and, you have a renter that hasn't communicated? Like what's available for them? What kind of assistance is available to landlords as well? Courtney?
I can touch on that. I think Matt probably can too. So in the governor's announcement on Thursday, they did set aside $5 million. We don't necessarily know how that's going to be deployed yet, but that will be for small, so your individual rental property owners. So we'll figure out in the coming weeks how that will be deployed. But there is eviction assistance and there's small business assistance available through the various counties and cities as well.
Well, and to that point, Luigi, I think part of the frustration I've heard from members is beyond fatigue, there's confusion because we're using terms like eviction prevention or postponed evictions, foreclosure prevention. These are kind of the sinking ship aspects of the real estate timeline. We have folks that are headed in that direction, but are reaching out for assistance now. And that's what's not communicated with dollars that are available for assistance. Some states, are dedicating it more towards private property protection funds or, really speaking to the property owner as a business and getting them the assistance they need. Courtney's mentioned the $5 million for foreclosure assistance. When we have a rental assistance program that applications would speak to more than $5 million. We're predicting that the need is much higher. I don't have a rough number for you, but state comparison, we're not dedicating enough.
So here's another question from Craig. I heard Courtney correctly. She said that the rental study that was done did not include affordable housing. And I guess this goes to the bigger problems of housing that we've had, for decades, right? But maybe this is a question for Representative Toma. From Craig, we have a serious affordable housing crisis, and we have also seen rental increases in Maricopa County especially go up at rates higher than across the nation. These are both critical parts of this discussion. I operate CAS, and we daily see the impact of rental increases in forcing more people into homelessness. We have also been working with people who stay at our shelters who cannot find affordable housing. Representative Toma, so this goes to, I guess, the bigger housing issue of affordability. But, it's kind of a pretty broad question, right? How do you go about solving it?
Well, I think it's a very complicated issue. I will tell you that as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm a real estate broker. And so I don't do a lot of transactions myself, but my agents do. And I'm telling you, it's a very interesting market. And Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I've ever seen month's supply be as low as it is right now. In other words, we don't have inventory on the resale side. Same thing seems to be true on the rental side, partially perhaps because we're obviously we're trying to do everything we can to keep people in their homes, and that's laudable, at least in intent. But people have to live somewhere, and so when you don't have when you don't have availability, you're gonna cause all kinds of other issues. Plus, it is my understanding the builders have basically stopped, and a lot of the developments have hit pause wherever they can because of the uncertainty that was mentioned earlier. And so this is only going to get worse, is the point. I know people have tried to draw allusions to this being similar to 2008, 2009. It's not similar to 2008, 2009, partially because that was driven by real estate. An overinflation of real estate where, depending on whose numbers you believe, a quarter of the homes that were out there and properties that were out there were owned by investors that were basically just speculating, playing the appreciation game. And at some point, the carousel stopped, and everybody realized that no place to land, right? Which was a considerably different situation than it is now. Right now, what's causing those price increases you're talking about is a lack of inventory. And that is just simple supply and demand. Since everybody has to live somewhere, this is not optional. You're going to have to find products for these people. But to go back to your question, affordable housing is one of those very complicated issues that I've been had the pleasure, unfortunately, in some cases, of having worked through in the House in the couple of years that I've been there. And there are no perfect solutions. But one of the things that I will say is that I think especially municipalities and counties at this point have to go back and relook at what they have in terms of requirements to building and to development. Because I'm not talking about just zoning, but just hurdles to development. And that would include things like time required for approvals and those types of things. We have to really cut red tape in that space as well. And we have to figure out how to do that soon. Otherwise, you're not going to see affordable housing. Because the thing is, think about it from a very basic business perspective. If I'm going to spend all that time and effort to try to build something where I can only make some small fraction of what I can on the open market, if you will, on non-affordable housing, I'm not going to do that as an investor, right? Unless I have some sort of government incentive or assistance to do so. So maybe in addition to some of the programs that we've tried to do, I know there have been some that have been mixed, have been received in mixed company, if you will. LIHTC, for example, we worked on that in the legislature. But perhaps other programs where maybe governments and local governments partner with us at the state, but again, a lot of times these are municipal issues that really streamline and get approvals done very, very quickly, waive fees, that sort of thing. Get it done as quickly as possible, get their approvals done as quickly as possible to ensure that that these programs are worth it for the developers that really need to get into this space at this point.
Yeah, and really to add to that, I mean, we're concerned with the continued eviction delay and moratorium that, you can't expect that a rental operator is going to be able to go 220 days without income. These properties are going to go into foreclosure. There's going to be bankruptcy, and these properties are going to transfer. Typically when that happens, and what we saw in the last downturn is when they go through bankruptcy and foreclosure, these properties that may have been affordable in the past are not affordable properties in the future. They get updated, their rents get increased. So we're very fearful that through this process, we're actually going to exacerbate the existing affordable housing problem.
So here's one question from Boaz. For renters who are ghosting their landlords and not paying rent, what steps can be taken to get more information about the details of their situation? I know John or Courtney or Matt, if you want to take a crack at this question.
I'm not sure I totally followed you on the question, but I can tell you, I mean, I think there's a wide variety of reasons why residents are ghosting. It's either, they're embarrassed by their situation, but they shouldn't be, because we are all in this situation. But there are some, and I'll use the example of a friend of mine who has a rental here in Scottsdale, and she reached out to her residents and said, what's the situation? There's no response. She went by the unit, issued a notice of inspection, and they changed the locks. They've just gone dark on her. They've changed the locks. She can't access her own rental property. So there are examples of situations like that.
So here's another question from Bea. Why can't government pay landlords directly? I think some renters are gaming the system and keeping the money for other uses and not paying rent. I have 2 rental homes and one is not paying. I know they get some assistance. Danny, let me ask you, because this is probably a macro economic discussion, right? So what about the idea of just government paying the landlords directly?
Yeah, that's again, I'm not an expert of government administration, but the mechanism I think is less important than the objective, which is to compensate these owners for the loss. Like a government action has shifted a financial burden from one small group to another small group, and so that's just patently unfair. And so that's from an economic perspective, there needs to be recourse for any of those people that are um, incurring a loss because of a government action. So I would be less focused on the mechanism. A direct payment to a landlord could be an option. I don't know if there's a legal or any sort of administrative issue to that, but the mechanism to us is less important from an economic perspective. Anyone who is incurring a loss because of the government action needs to be compensated.
Representative Toma, you wanna jump in on that one, sir?
Yeah. Thanks. Courtney, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there already is a precedent for this. I remember distinctly working on some bills where Section 8, I think it was paying landlords directly in kind of a batch process in that case. But I think there already is precedent for that. I don't think there's anything prohibiting some of these programs to be structured in such a way that the landlord receives a payment on behalf of a specific tenant.
Yeah, and in all the state program, the local programs, all of the payments do go directly to the landlord for the benefit of the resident. But the key and what we've asked to be able to do is for the rental property owner to be able to apply for assistance on behalf of the renter. We have the information. We have a copy of the lease. We have all the things that are needed to get the process started and ease that burden from the renter.
There was one question about how many renters do we have in the state, and I think the number is 919,000, or rather close to 920,000. We are almost out of time. Here's a question from Sam. It seems all of you agree that effective deployment of available rental assistance funds is a choke point, right? Is there a coordinated advocacy response? In other words, what, if anything, are they doing or you're doing as an industry to help solve this problem? And Courtney, you might want to take a crack at this one.
So yeah, we have, I mean, since COVID hit back in February, at a federal level and a state level, we have been advocating for the resources. And it's, you know, we're just frustrated that it's been slow for these resources to be rolled out. But we have advocated for the resources. We will continue to advocate for the resources. I know our industry will continue to work with residents. We'll work out payment plans. We will continue to waive fees when it's COVID related. We'll do everything we can to keep residents in their house, but we will certainly continue to advocate at the state and federal and local levels.
John, just real quick, in your experience, in your community's experience, has the number of people who've just gone dark, has it increased or has it remained the same?
It actually doubled from June to July. And my concern is with the extension that there will be some more momentum with that. You know, having that extend to 10/31 to the eyes of many might say, well, does it end in October? Does it continue through the end of the year? Does it go into 2021? It's unknown. So I think the ghost renters, if you will, might just say, you know what, I'm going to continue forward with my decision. And I think there will be some momentum with others participating or moving from the partial payments into non-paying.
I do have we're pretty much out of time. I do have one question for Courtney. What happens when October rolls, the eviction moratorium is lifted?
So first of all, we were hopeful that it was going to be lifted this week. We are hopeful it'll be lifted on October the 31st. But I'll tell you this, I mean, as an industry, we can't expect rental housing owners to continue to provide free housing. It's obviously a critical necessity, but we're not asking grocery stores to provide free food to customers who have a COVID-related situation. We're not asking restaurants, or we're not mandating restaurants provide free meals when there's a COVID-related situation. We can't require rental housing owners to provide free housing any longer.
And with that, Matt, John, Danny, Representative Toma, Courtney, thank you for your time this morning. To our audience, to our viewers and our listeners, I hope we were able to answer some of your questions. Again, go to the Arizona Department of Housing's website. You should be able to find help there. If you're struggling with rent payment, go to your county's websites. Talk to your landlords. Go to faith-based organizations. If there's $130 million in rental assistance, at some point that's going to become available. And so I hope you stay safe, enjoy the rest of your day, and have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it. Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.